Hello folks, I hope that you are just having a great day today. Today I've got something really special for you. We're going to be looking at the first book of swords by Fred Saberhagen that was published in 1983. It's the first part of the Complete Book of Swords series that opens up a deep dive into this post-apocalyptic fantasy world that was started with Empire of the East that you read that we've done reviews for in the 70s, and this is a sequel that's set thousands and thousands and thousands of years in the future after the events that have occurred in that world, and less ancient stuff is still happening, although it's still a part of the storyline and part of the world building. The world is unnamed. Fans have called it Arneh's world that it's set at. So let's take a look at this this novel that was written in 1983. Now, I started reading J.R.R. Tolkien and I read his The Hobbit in later part, like the last few days of my fourth grade year. And then in the summer of between fourth grade and fifth grade, I took on the challenge of taking on The Lord of the Rings, which started off kind of like The Hobbit, but by the time you're over with it, it's this deep, intricate, detailed, deep dive into these three trilogy books that are really meant more for adults than for kids, like The Hobbit was meant for. It was the first book that I had ever read for adults, and I really enjoyed doing it. After I did that, I became really obsessed with fantasy, and it took me basically the summer to knock it out. And so when I went into the opening days of my first day in fifth grade, I decided to see what books the school library had available that were available for me to read that were in fantasy. The first book I picked up was Dragon Song by Anne McCaffrey, which was still set for young adults. I loved it. I read that whole series, that whole trilogy of books. I've already reviewed those for you. And then after that, I then said, well, what next? Let's go back to reading some stuff for adults. And this book, this trilogy, The Complete Book of Swords by Fred Saberhagen, was the first adult book that I read after The Lord of the Rings, and it is very much a high fantasy sort of story. And I loved it. I still love it to this day. Now, I've gone back and tried to reread some things that I read when I was a kid to see what I still think of them, if I still like them or not. And I've been doing that kind of for the past year or so. I haven't read this trilogy in more than a decade. It's probably been more like 15 years since I've read it, and I had obviously forgotten some things that have happened in it. So I said, let's go back and read it again and see if it's hit my notes again. I'm recording this on a Saturday. I started this book again on Wednesday. I finished it after spending about 2 hours today knocking it out. It took me about 5.5, 6 hours to read total. It's 200 pages in my oversized book, and this is probably the fourth time I've read it. And my goal is to finish this trilogy too. I really enjoy it a lot, and I wanted to bring it to your attention in case you've never heard of The Complete Book of Swords by Fred Saberhagen. So what winds up happening, this is an epic storyline, and what's basically happening is that we're going to start with the god Vulcan in the prelude, and the god Vulcan is basically setting up a forge and some stuff and gathering supplies and equipment in order to set about making this tremendous crap that he's going to be making. And he realizes that he's going to need some human servants in order to, man the forge, bring in the materials. So he is going, and he also realizes that it would be pretty useful if he can slake them after these blades have been made, and slake them in the blood of humans. So he goes off to recruit some humans. Then we're going to flash forward in the prelude, and we're going to find Jord the Smith, who's now one-armed, from this distant village out in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, and he has come back one-armed with a sword that was crafted by Vulcan, and he basically tells people that this was his payment for his arm and his service to the god. And the god has told him, Vulcan has told him, that this is his sword to keep and to give to his children as an inheritance. And so that's the prelude, and that basically sets up what's happening. The gods have created this cycle of swords, have sprinkled them around the world, one of which has gone to Jord, the master smith, who now moves and becomes a miller, because it's hard to smith without your right hand, but he can still be a miller with just one-handed. And so he moves, buys out, and switches his profession. He marries a second wife. He has 2 kids with his first wife, who died. He was a widow, and then he had a third wife. and he'll have a child 9 months after they got married, and that child is Mark. And Mark is going to be our main primary point of view character for the story, although we will view other characters as well that become supporting characters, and we will follow them along through chapters or halves of chapters in places throughout the novel, so it does pick up the scenes from other places. But Mark is the primary point of view character. He's almost 13. He's about 12 and some, and so but he's not 13 yet. When some things happen, and in the first chapter, what we're going to find out is that him and his small family life is about to be shattered because a nobleman and a relation to the Duke, and the Duke has a dark sort of presence, and he does some dark and nasty things to his people. He has a bad reputation among his peasants, and basically what's going to wind up happening is that one of his essentials has come to visit this tiny little town that they've removed to, but still bigger than the one that they left, and that the family of 5 has left. And what's going to wind up happening is that the oldest brother, the one who was the firstborn son of George, the now Miller, has been told. Tells him about the sword and the inheritance. He goes and brings it to the seneschal. He's on his way bringing it over along with George, who's coming with him in order to talk to the seneschal. He's not going to let his son take his gift from Vulcan out there. And then there is an attack that is launched by some raiders that are very well supplied, and they have war beasts, which is unusual. And this attack is basically pushed aside on this town, is pushed aside by the person who's wielding the sword that's called Town Saver. And he will use this sword to kill everything that's attacking, from the war beasts to the people. And then at the end, he saves the town with this sword, but his wounds are so severe that he dies after the battle ends. The magic leaves him, and he dies from his wounds in the battle. Seeing his elder brother die in the battle, Mark tried to help him with his bow and arrow. One of his arrows actually flew through and hit the neck of the seneschal and killed him accidentally. And so his mother tells him to flee because people have been killed for a lot less than they've done to the Duke's men, and he killed one of the Duke's men with his bow and arrow. So he leaves and flees, and he takes Town Saver with him, believing that his father has also died because he's been wounded, as well as his brother, and takes the sword and then flees the town. And that's basically the first chapter and the prelude. I'll go ahead and end you to it. But this is an epic tale. It has a lot of political infighting that's involved. A lot of powers that be are going to have various interests in these blades. We're going to have an old sort. We're going to have a clash of powers at the political and military levels, and it's going to have a lot of stuff that's very much an epic, sweeping fantasy story. And Mark is going to be the key person in this story, and he'll encounter other sword wielders and other swords over the course of his adventure in the first novel. Again, the first novel was written in 1983. Now, I think it's a 9 out of 10. I love this series so much. Went back and read it. Still love it. It's very, very impactful for me. I talked about this actually in a section where I give you 10 of my own personal inspirations from fantasy that have inspired me, and that I call my Appendix N. That's based on Gary Gygax's Appendix N, where he talks about the influential things for himself in Dungeons & Dragons that he creates in one of his books in an Appendix N in a DM's in 1979 in the first edition of the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. And then he puts in a number of works and writers that have heavily influenced him. And Fred Saberhagen, not this series was written after Dungeons & Dragons got started, but Fred Saberhagen is actually listed in Appendix N by Gary Gygax, the Empire of the East trilogy that I've already reviewed for you. That is the prelude, if you will, of this trilogy, although you can read it without this trilogy. You don't need to have read the Empire of the East stuff because this is, although it's set in the same world, it's a very, very different time in the world, and previous knowledge of the world is not needed in order to enjoy this trilogy on its own. But again, it's a great novel. I could not recommend it more for you. I've gone back and reread it just now, loved it again, still just enamored with the story, the swords, the characters, the adventure, and I think Fred Saberhagen does a great job here. He was influential in me as well as Gary Gygax, and he's one of the people that are on both of our Appendix N's. So I'll have you read the first book of the Swords? Have you heard of it? What'd you think of it? Did you agree or disagree with anything that I talked about in here? Man, I would be more than happy to engage you with it further in the comments below. Whatever your thoughts are. If you like this video, please feel encouraged to hit that subscribe button, because there's going to be a lot more of these to follow in fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And finally, I just want to thank you for taking some time out of your day and investing it and watching my video. We all have so many things that are happening in our lives, right? And we're being pulled in so many different directions. So the fact that you spent this time with me, wow, that's humbling. I appreciate it again, and thanks.